I knew my family never really saw me, but the night my sister laughed at me in front of everyone, something inside me cracked. Rowan lifted her wine glass, smirked, and said I should stop playing pretend entrepreneur, as if my entire life was some kind of joke. The room erupted in laughter. No one looked at me. No one defended me. Not even once. In that moment, the humiliation burned so deep I felt my chest tighten from the inside out. Zephyr Elaine, realized they hadn't just overlooked me for years, they'd erased me. What they didn't know was that I carried a secret big enough to shatter every assumption they had ever made about me. And, that night, I finally decided to use it. The rain had been tapping against the metal roof long before I opened my eyes. 6 a.m. Seattle still half asleep. The sky a familiar sheet of muted gray. My laptop glowed from the corner of the studio. The screen paused on lines of work I'd pushed through until exhaustion finally won. Papers lay scattered across the desk. Whiteboard full of formulas and sketches, a quiet universe no one in my family had ever bothered to understand. I sat up slowly, letting the cold from the concrete floor pull me the rest of the way into the day. This wasn't a morning for work. It was a morning for packing, traveling, slipping back into a version of myself I never quite recognized. My mother's 62nd birthday dinner meant flying to Colorado, where tradition wasn't a practice, it was a commandment. And at that dinner, I already knew which role I'd be assigned: the quiet daughter who drifted somewhere on the edges of expectation. My phone buzzed with Rowan's name flashing across the screen. I watched it vibrate until it stopped. She'd been calling more often lately, living in her world of press events and sustainable fashion panels. To the family! Rowan was a story worth retelling. I was the vague mention offered as an afterthought. She's somewhere in Seattle, doing tech stuff that was their version of me. I closed my laptop, gathered the folders I needed, and zipped my carry-on. Standing at the doorway, I paused. The rain had softened into mist, brushing over the city like a quiet reminder that here, at least, no one demanded anything from me. Colorado never offered that kind of mercy. I reached Evergreen Ridge just past noon the next day. The Colorado air carried a sharp, dry cold that felt nothing like the damp breath of Seattle. My parents' wooden house sat on a sloped ridge, its windows catching the thin winter sunlight, reflecting patches of melting snow like small shards of glass scattered across the yard. Rowan arrived moments after I did, stepping out of a gleaming electric SUV wrapped in one of her recycled denim jackets. It wasn't subtle. Nothing about her entrances ever was. Mom rushed straight into her arms, the way she always did, as if Rowan had just returned from saving the world. They didn't do that with me anymore. Maybe they forgot. Maybe they stopped trying. Lunch was already laid out on the long table. Dad barely sat before launching into the newest articles praising Rowan's brand, calling her the rising figure of sustainable fashion. Rowan accepted it all with the practiced modesty of someone used to admiration. She talked about Austin Tech Fashion Week, about her panel discussions, about how staying confident and persistent had shaped her success. I broke pieces of warm bread and let the steam from the soup fog my glasses, listening while staying small in my seat, a skill I'd learned younger than I should have. Then Dad turned to me, asking how my work was going. Rowan cut in before I could lift my eyes. She said I was still tinkering with little tech projects, still circling around without any real direction, still waiting to grow up. The table chuckled softly. I forced a thin smile and said I was fine. They didn't know what New York had taken from me, or what I'd built quietly afterward. Rowan patted my shoulder when lunch ended, offering to guide me someday. I told her to focus on her company first. She laughed. My eyes didn't. That afternoon, I drove to Denver. The highway stretched ahead in long, pale lines, the mountains steady on the horizon like they were watching everything unfold. No one at home knew why I needed to make this stop, and I didn't offer an explanation. They wouldn't have believed it anyway. The parking garage beneath Northwood Meridian Capitol hummed with the low echo of engines shutting off. I walked to the private elevator, slipped my badge across the reader, and watched the screen flicker awake with a greeting that wouldn't make sense to anyone in my family. "Welcome back, Ms. Lane." I stepped into the small conference room where a stack of documents already waited under a dim overhead light. Quarterly risk review. Rowan Lane Applied Textiles. I scanned through the pages while the advisory team filed in. The meeting moved quickly, each line a deeper cut than the last. Burn rate tripled. Cash flow inversion projected within 4 months. 2 major California partners already withdrawn. And 3 urgent warnings from Rowan's CFO ignored. When the lead advisor finally turned to me and asked whether I wanted to activate the withdraw primary capital option, the room seemed to narrow. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I only flipped to the last page, the one I'd seen 100 times. Owner Zafira Lane, primary decision maker. They didn't know that the $150 million sustaining Rowan's company hadn't come from her charisma, nor from investors impressed by her speeches. It came from me, from years of rebuilding, from believing in an industry long before Rowan ever stepped into it. I'd never needed spotlight, but the one she lived under was starting to flicker. The steakhouse was loud enough to swallow every thought I tried to keep to myself. Warm lights hung low over the long table, reflecting off polished wood, and plates piled high with Texas-style steaks. I slipped into the last seat, hoping to disappear into the hum of conversation. But of course, Rowan chose that moment to make her entrance. She walked in late, wrapped in her signature recycled denim jacket, and the entire room shifted toward her like someone had adjusted a spotlight. She hugged our mother, then floated to the center of the table as if the night belonged to her. When the main course arrived, my father stood and asked her to share something about her journey. Rowan never missed a cue. She talked proudly about the investors backing her brand, calling them the best of the best, the ones who spotted true vision. The table gasped in admiration. And my mother wiped her eyes as if she were watching her daughter win an award. I tightened my hold on the napkin under the table until the fabric twisted between my fingers. Then came the dig disguised as wisdom, aimed directly at me. Real business requires understanding capital, networks, pressure. Not everyone can handle this level. My aunt turned and asked what I'd been doing in Seattle. Before I could answer, Rowan laughed softly and said I was playing pretend entrepreneur in a tiny industrial studio. The table burst into laughter, sharp, careless, crushing. I met her gaze, steady and cold, and told her I hoped her company stayed alive long enough for her to teach anyone anything. She blinked, confused. I left early. Something inside me had finally cracked open. Seattle was slick with rain when I got back. It was 1:30 a.m., the streets almost empty, and the kind of quiet that made every thought echo louder. I unlocked my studio and dropped my bag beside the door, walking straight to my laptop without turning on a single light. The screen lit up the room in a cold blue wash that matched exactly how I felt. 17 unread emails waited. The first warned that the company had only 4 months of runway left. The second confirmed that the Los Angeles supplier had cut ties. The third projected insolvency if spending continued. I scrolled through each line, each red flag. Rowan's downfall wasn't a matter of if, it was when. Then I opened the financial ledger and found what I'd suspected: $62,000 spent on an influencer retreat in Santa Monica. Another $38,000 on vague PR events with no documentation. She'd been pouring investor money into maintaining her image, not her operations. I logged into the restricted investment portal. The words glowed on the screen like a verdict. Primary capital owner, Zafira Lane, authority level, maximum option, withdraw. Enabled. One click, and everything she paraded tonight would crumble. I remembered the laughter at the table, the way she used my name like a punchline. Some words weigh nothing but land like blades. At 2:14 a.m., an advisor emailed they suspected Rowan was hiding even more. I didn't hesitate. I requested a full audit. And just like that, the last thread tying me to Rowan's polished world finally snapped. The morning after the audit, Seattle felt eerily still. No rain, no wind. Just a flat gray sky, stretched tight, like something was waiting to snap. My phone buzzed nonstop before I even made it to the kitchen. Bad news moves faster than weather. I didn't need to read the screen to know where it came from. The first email from Northwood Meridian hit the hardest: a formal notice, demanding a restructuring review within 48 hours. That wasn't a suggestion. It was a countdown. I poured coffee with hands steadier than I expected, opened the next message, and saw the words I knew were coming. The Los Angeles supplier was terminating immediately. They couldn't work with a company under financial scrutiny, a crack in the dam, and everything behind it ready to break. By noon, Rowan's name flashed across my phone. I let it ring once before picking up. Her voice trembled beneath forced composure as she said investors were pulling away. Something was wrong. She didn't understand why. I glanced at her cash flow dashboard on my screen, each number collapsing like a row of falling tiles. I told her calmly she had management issues. She inhaled sharply, insisting real business wasn't as simple as the things I worked on, that this was adult responsibility she had to shoulder alone. She still saw me as the kid sister fumbling in the dark. Even as I stared at data that could drown her entire company, I warned her to brace herself for tomorrow. She asked why. Because the review meeting is set. Her breathing hitched. She begged me to help, said I was the only one in the family who understood any of this. If she'd said that a year ago, the ground might have shifted differently. I ended the call with a neutral reminder for her to stay calm. What I didn't say was the truth. The storm coming wouldn't spare anyone. By late afternoon, my mother called, her voice tight enough to fray. "Rowan needs us," she said, as if Rowan were some fragile thing teetering on the edge. When I stepped into the house, the living room was already packed. My father stood red-faced and frantic in the center. Rowan sat curled into herself on the couch, eyes swollen from crying. Not a single glance turned toward me. My father announced that Rowan's biggest investor was pulling out and that we needed a plan before everything collapsed. I leaned against the doorway, watching the panic swirl around the room. None of them knew the truth that the decision they feared wasn't coming from a stranger. Then my mother suggested selling the Wyoming ranch, the only asset my parents had left. Her voice shook with devotion. Not logic. Rowan didn't stop her. She sat quietly, letting them scramble to rescue her. The way she always had. My aunt turned to me next, asking if I knew anyone in tech who could help. I almost laughed at the absurdity. The only person who could save Rowan was already standing here, unnoticed as usual. Rowan looked up, pleading for solutions, insisting she trusted my understanding of business, in my own way. Words meant to soften, but sharp enough to reopen a familiar wound. I asked if she wanted to meet her largest investor. The room went silent. Then Rowan nodded quickly, desperate. She asked if I knew them. I set my teacup down and told her they would meet her tomorrow, and she would finally hear the truth. A few people snickered, thinking I was joking. Rowan tilted her head as if I'd said something childish. She had no idea. The access card in my coat pocket knocked lightly against my phone, a quiet reminder that tomorrow wasn't just a meeting. It was 30 years of being overlooked, finally coming due. The morning of the meeting, Denver felt like it had been carved from ice. Snow whipped against the windows of Northwood Meridian Capital as I stepped off the elevator onto the 22nd floor. My family was already gathered, stiff and silent. The fear in the room almost louder than their breathing. Rowan sat among them, shoulders squared, makeup flawless. But the shadows under her eyes told the truth she wouldn't say out loud. She asked where the lead investor was. I simply nodded toward the doorway as the advisory team walked in carrying thick binders that hit the table with a thud heavy enough to echo. The room fell quiet as the screen flickered on. The head advisor spoke plainly. The company was in severe financial crisis, bleeding cash, drowning in mismanagement, and showing signs of buried spending. A massive red graph lit up the room like an alarm. My mother gripped my father's arm. Rowan's face drained of color. Then the advisor gestured to the empty chair beside me, explaining that no decision could be made without the primary decision-maker. Every head turned. I placed my laptop on the table, typed in the password, and rotated the screen toward them. Primary capital owner, Zafira Lane. Total invested, $150, $1,000, decision, authority, exclusive. The silence cracked open around us. I spoke softly, evenly. I'm the investor you've been searching for, and today, I decide the company's fate. The hallway emptied after the meeting, everyone scattering like shadows slipping out of reach. I walked in the opposite direction, toward the parking garage, the echo of my own footsteps steady against the concrete. Then I heard Rowan's heels behind me, unsteady clicks that faltered more with every step. Zeph, wait. I stopped only when the cold air hit me, the kind that scraped across the skin like dry paper. Rowan stood a few feet away, mascara streaking down her face, tears cutting lines through the makeup she'd applied so carefully that morning. Is it true? 2 years? You were the one keeping my company alive? Her voice cracked as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry. I nodded once. She swallowed hard. Why? There was confusion in her eyes, but also something more fragile, a kind of fear she'd never let anyone see until now. Rowan staggered back until she hit the concrete wall, her hands shaking violently. If you expose that, she whispered, I lose everything. I met her eyes. No, Rowan, you only lose what was never yours to begin with. The wind cut through the open garage, wrapping us both in a silence too wide to escape. But I don't want you to fail. I said, softer now. I want you to grow up. I explained that I hadn't destroyed the company. I'd handed control to a new executive team, people capable of fixing what she'd broken and putting the mission back on track. Rowan covered her face and began to cry. Not the dramatic tears she offered cameras, but the brittle, breaking sobs of someone finally meeting their own reflection. And in that cold, echoing space, her pride, the thing she'd protected her whole life, finally shattered. 3 months later, I stepped out of SeaTac into a curtain of rain so fine it felt like breath. Seattle hadn't changed. It still smelled faintly of coffee and damp stone. Traffic along I-5 still hummed like a slow heartbeat beneath the city lights. For the first time in a long while, the familiar gray didn't feel heavy. It felt welcoming. I rolled my small suitcase back to my studio, the place that had once felt too quiet, too narrow, too much like a refuge built out of necessity rather than choice. Now, unlocking the door, it felt like home again. The soft buzz of the overhead lamp flickered to life, and I opened my laptop on instinct, letting the glow fill the room. The quarterly report from Rowan's company sat at the top of my inbox. I opened it expecting the usual chaos out of habit, only to freeze when the numbers finally turned from red to green. Growth, stabilization, a business not held together by hope and denial, but by structure, discipline, and a leadership team willing to face reality instead of flattering it. My phone buzzed a moment later. I looked at her, really looked, at the woman who had been raised on praise that never belonged entirely to her. The woman who'd grown to believe the world owed her its applause. Because your vision mattered, I said quietly. I believed in it long before you ever stepped on a stage. But you used it the wrong way. You stopped listening. You stopped seeing reality. Rowan shook her head, reaching for excuses. You should have told me if something was wrong. I cut her off, my voice sharper than I'd ever allowed it to be. Even if I had, you wouldn't have heard me. You never do. She froze, arms hanging limp at her sides, so I told her the truth I'd buried for years, the truth she had never cared to ask about. Her mentor in New York, the man who supposedly championed her rise, had stolen my research and handed it to her like a shiny gift. I walked away not because I was weak, but because I refused to live in a place that treated her as the sun and me as a shadow no one bothered to see. Rowan's name appeared with a message so simple, it tightened my throat more than any apology ever could. Thank you for not abandoning me. Just 2 months ago, those words wouldn't have existed in her vocabulary, not for me. Not for anyone who didn't belong on the pedestal she'd been raised to believe was hers alone. But now she said them, and meant them. My family's shift was just as quiet, almost tentative, as if they were learning a new language. My father started asking about my work without cutting me off halfway through. My mother sent photos of the snow piling around the porch, asking whether Seattle winters were treating me gently. No one spoke to me like I was the dim corner of the room anymore. They didn't overwhelm me with apologies or grand gestures. They simply stopped looking past me, and that alone changed everything. Standing on my balcony that night, the rain tapping steadily on the old metal awning, I let the chill soak into my skin. I used to avoid the light because it always felt like something that could expose me, bruise me, pull me apart. All my life, I thought the only way to survive was to shrink. Not anymore. I didn't need to shine like Rowan. I didn't need the applause, the headlines, the image. I just needed to take up my own space without apologizing for it, to exist on my own terms, without the weight of being misunderstood pressing down on my shoulders. For the first time in years, I felt this looseness in my chest, this quiet sense of belonging inside myself, a freedom that had nothing to do with money or power, and everything to do with finally being seen, even in silence. Seattle's rain kept falling, steady and gentle, but this time, it didn't drown me. It washed me clean.